Good evening, everyone in the room, Sparta, and online. It is talk number 5 of this semester, and we are very happy to have the director of the Kunstverein München with us tonight, Maurin Dietrich. And we give it over to Maurin now. Welcome, Maurin.
Thank you so much for having me. I will share my screen now. You have to make me host first.
Yes, it works.
Perfect. Can you hear and see me, or rather see the presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. I'm just gonna 1 second. Yeah, perfect. Okay, I'll start. Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for the invitation. I really admire the work that Sparta has been doing and have been following it. Less on site, more digitally. I would have loved to travel today, but since I'm sort of my home, temporary home is in Munich, but my family and friends are in Berlin. So introducing Düsseldorf as another overnight thing was sort of almost impossible towards the end of this year, because we're also opening this huge Jahresgaben exhibition on Friday. But yeah, since briefly, since 2019, I'm the director of Kunstverein München, where together with my team, I program exhibitions, discursive programs, residencies, publications, and many more public but also non-public formats. We can speak about this later. And before that, I worked at KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin. And on the side, I co-founded a project space situated on Leipziger Straße together with the artist Jonas Wendelin. It's titled Fragile, and I did a couple of other things that we can maybe talk about later. And today, under the title Compare Me to Myself, I'm going to talk about the artistic production in the context of Kunstverein München, briefly elaborate on what I think is a quite unique institutional model, that of the Kunstvereine, give a brief introduction into the work of Kunstverein München, as we're also celebrating 200 years anniversary next year. And then after sort of 5 to 10 minutes, I'm gonna sort of focus on the practice of Patty Hill, an artist that died in 2014, and at Kunstverein München, we presented her first posthumous solo exhibition in Europe in 2020, beginning of the pandemic. Yeah, and the title of the presentation, Compare Me to Myself, is both a sentence that I found in one of the notebooks that Patty Hill left, but it's also, as I said, a quite compelling and interesting, well, probably more of a thesis that we will look at tonight, of sort of the uncomparability of the institutional model of a Kunstverein, but it really departs and centers around the practice of Patty Hill. So just something very briefly about the model of the Kunstverein, because I think it's yeah, we can not elaborate on that later, but I think it's really interesting to look closely at this. It's they were more or less the earliest ones were founded in the late early 1900s in Germany by what we have to understand an aspiring bourgeoisie, a very specific social class that wanted and seeked spaces not only for self-organizing but also self-representation. And obviously these subjects changed over the last couple of decades and centuries, but it's still important to understand this sort of founding moment in which they emerged. the sort of foundational structure today is that everyone can become a member in any Kunstvereine that exists, and by an open voting process, you can vote on the board that then elects the director for a set time of years. This, I would argue, of sort of concrete and very lived and embodied spaces of direct democracy, at least they can be. They are historically spaces, and how we understand them, how I understand them, and the team understands them, spaces predominantly looking at emerging practices of artists that have, for one reason or another, and we can discuss this later, have been also neglected by other institutions historically. And I think they are important mediators between museums and civic society. And just something very quickly about the Kunstverein München. It was founded in 1823, and as I said, will celebrate its 200 years anniversary next year. It gained, since I would say in the 1980s, gained international recognition far beyond the sort of city limits by staging very innovative but also very controversial exhibitions of contemporary artists, and its discourses often hosting the first institutional exhibitions by artists such as Lutz Bacher that we see here, artists such as Adrian Piper or Andrea Fraser or Christopher Williams. But these Kunstvereine were not only spaces for the representation and presentation and the production of contemporary art, but they were also spaces for very sort of civil spaces for very vital and controversial social exchange, in which a sort of also critical awareness of what is considered contemporary art could develop through a very active engagement with the public. And I just wanted to show you these pictures. It's one of the board meetings in the 1970s where the old board was voted down by a majority of young artists that then sort of installed a new director and sort of shaped the institutional program up until today. And something else that I wanted to just quickly sort of reference in the context of Sparta is another thing that we started doing as part of the new program at Kunstverein München, is a summer school that looks at the sort of archive at Kunstverein München through a 1-week learning program where we invite artists, historians, theorists, as well as 50 students or no longer students to work with us and come to Munich. So sort of really testing out non-hierarchical modes of teaching and learning. If you're interested, I just wanted to share that with you. And before I jump into the topic of today, Patty Hill, I wanted to quickly show you something that I consider quite an important part of the program at Kunstverein in a sort of lead up to the bicentennial anniversary that we're celebrating next year, 200 years. We created this archive space, which is a permanent space at Kunstverein München, which houses the archive, but only parts of it. Large part of it is in the city archive, but it's also the place where the large formats of the large amounts of the public programs are conceived, where we invite historians, theorists to look at not only what can be found in the archive, but also what is missing from there, what are the sort of histories of oral tradition that should be included in the sort of documented written history of that archive. It's also a space where, in relation to all of the exhibitions that we do, we look at themes and questions and how they resonate in the archive of Kunstverein München. And it's really a sort of process in trying to combine what we understand is the sort of, the written history of that institution, and really question through the lens of inviting artists to engage with that material and question its status and its relevance today. And this brings me right to the central theme of tonight, Patty Hill. Very briefly, an introduction into her biography. She was born in 1921 in Kentucky and died in 2014 in Sens in France, which is a small sort of suburban town outside Paris, and left behind a really impressive output spanning almost 6 years of artistic production, really across various disciplines. She was interestingly untrained as an artist, and she began to use the photocopier as an artistic medium in sort of late early 70s, and continued to do so until her death, and really left behind almost more than 10,000 works, very much exploring the relationship between image and text. And in addition to these very comprehensive sort of body of work of xerographic works, she published 4 novels, a memoir, wrote a brilliant biography on her close friend and lover Diane Arbus, and published books of poetry, and so on and so forth. And although the sort of center part of Kunstverein München's exhibition was to forefront and show these works with the photocopier, we also considered her practice as an editor that both sort of, or the practice, her practice of publishing as a space and place to also edit, but interrogate and sort of accompany the visual work. And this was due to the fact that this was the first institutional solo exhibition in Europe ever. It was a sort of also fragmentary and necessarily also incomplete index of her engagement with these questions. And the exhibition included, as I said, published novels, poems, sketchbooks, unpublished manuscripts, and letters in addition to the works. And in addition to the works that Patty Hill conceived as works during her, and also exhibited during her lifetime, because she did predominantly in the US, and the exhibition included a very large amount of works that have never been shown. And I will come back to this later, because it's a complex situation in which Patty left more than 10,000 works when she died. In most cases, she didn't leave like such a precise install plan as we see here, which she conceived for the exhibition titled Swan. And what is important to consider is that by using a machine that was sort of specifically, but also stereotypically linked to female and secretarial work, and therefore to feminized labor, she really tried to trace everyday objects, such as like a dish she would prepare for her daughter later, or like a carefully folded men's shirt. And she was trying to sort of develop and trace an artistic practice that would programmatically translate her very, what she said, very invisible work, very invisible domestic labor into a visual and public language. And through her use of these sort of reproductive apparatus of the copy machine, she created a model of artistic production that is sort of in opposition to well, questions or the convention of an individual expression, and also obviously also in opposition to any sort of opposed neutrality of technically produced images. This, and also the fact that obviously questions of authenticity, but also seriality and copy are not only an important question comes up right during that time, during the 60s and 70s, but is also at the very heart of contemporary art, was one of the questions that we felt very drawn to, and felt it was quite urgent to present that practice in Germany. And For the presentation in Munich, we were very aware that the majority, as I said before, of the public that will come and the visitors that will come and see this exhibition would not be familiar with works of Hill at all. And it would be the first time that they were introduced to the practice. We came up with a specific display that you see here, which is why I wanted to start with this, also showcasing not only her biography. I will come back to this later. On the right-hand side, you see a picture of her on the cover of the French Elle. She was also a couture model in the early 50s as a way to finance her art practice. But she was also quite successful novelist, actually, way before she started getting into visual art. So this was also a way to introduce a sort of life in which the work with the copy machine was not a late blooming, but was really deeply entangled in questions of publishing, how to make things public beyond the page of a book. And sort of following the visitors, you would arrive at what you see here is a sort of central space at Kunstverein München, where you would arrive at around an 8-meter long display table, where we presented the publishing practice in which text and work with the copier machine came together. And I wanted us to have a closer look at the book Slave Days, which you see on the upper right corner. It was published in 1975. And it's the first time where Patty Hill brings together a number of 29 poems and more than 31 photocopies, in which she sort of partly fictionalizes her everyday life as an artist, but also as a mother, as a housewife in the 60s and early 70s. And she also describes quite brutally the side of production with a very sinister humor. In one of the poems, she notes that, quote, "Heaven's door is open to us like a big vacuum cleaner," and quote, sort of outlining the limits of her own spaces of agency. And what is illustrated in this sort of density of the published materials, bringing together writing and xerography, is that her work with the photocopier in the 70s was not, as I said before, sort of late blooming in the next, but it was more like the next phase in a long artistic evolution that was complicated by the fact that she was a woman outside of the mainstream, not only isolated by place, but also by necessity. She was raising a child and managing a household, and working with also what we have to understand in like the late 60s and the early 70s is still a very emerging medium that wasn't necessarily at that time recognized as capital A art. In 1977, it's sort of a crucial moment that we wanted to represent in a space as well. Patty Hill meets the designer and architect Charles Eames on a transatlantic flight, quite at random. They're placed like just seated next to each other. And Charles Eames at that time is not only a designer, but he's also doing consulting work for the IT company IBM. And IBM at that time produces one of the most advanced copy machines that are incredibly costly to afford. One of the sort of most up-to-date or state-of-the-art copy machine at that time would cost something equivalent of around 100,000 euros today. So they're seated next to each other on this transatlantic flight, and she convinces him in 1971. They become friends, and they essentially start corresponding and very intimate letters about artistic production. And in 1971, she manages to basically, through him, get a hold of a copy machine that he sends to her home. And that time becomes an incredible important part, sort of important moment in her life, where she suddenly has access to a copy machine in her home. Before that, she would sneak into sort of big offices in central New York, together with the cleaning women that mostly started, cleaning the buildings in like the late evenings for the weekend. So she would snuck into the buildings with these cleaning personnel and then use the copy machine all through the weekend. She wouldn't sleep and just sort of work and play, also in this sort of intimate moment of not being seen, play with the copier machine, and then sort of basically leave these huge office buildings by Monday morning with these army of cleaning women unrecognized. But in 1979, she suddenly has access to this machine and starts developing a work titled Alphabet of Common Objects. It's one of her most important body of works. And it's a grid, which I showed you here, that comprises around 45 images that also convey and sort of attribute to the question how any how these images also have a sort of linguistic quality that she sees in them, and sort of an alphabetic linguistic quality. But yeah, with the copy at home, she's really able to expand on this notion. And she arranged this set of objects into a single work titled Alphabet of Common Objects. And for the exhibition at Kunstverein, we followed her installation process of how she showed the series once, leaving, as you can see here, 3 blank spaces where the works could not be located at the time of the exhibition, indicating also the sort of unfinished process of archiving that is still ongoing up until this date. One of the other central body of works presented at Kunstverein München are the series Garments that we see here, in which she works with various pieces of clothing, such as gloves that we see to the right, and also here up close, which as reproduced images are characterized often by this very high contrast lighting, as well as specific interventions that she did with the copy machine, such as adding excessive amounts of toner, which obviously also was not allowed if you just went into a copy shop, like playing with the machine like that. I am going to stay right here for a second. In this context, and also in the sort of process of working towards the exhibition at Kunstverein München, it was interesting for us to look back at theorists and writers that she knew or was inspired in also in conversation with, such as the author and activist Angela Davis, who and that really resonated with me and with us, the team at Kunstverein München, when we reread her book Woman, Race and Class, explaining how women's labor has been devalued in sort of the advanced capitalism of the 60s and 70s. And Davis writes that this basically the separation between domestic labor from immediate profit means that, quote unquote, women can seldom produce tangible evidence of their work. And I consider this very sort of socio-political context really interesting in the context of Patty Hill's artistic production, because it almost seems as though, if you imagine the glass plate of the copier machine, that the copy machine is not only the space where the production of the image happens, but it also is, or seems to be, you know, almost identical with the space where the household is being managed and worked in, where all this sort of labor, invisible labor of care is taking place. And here I would argue Patty Hill isn't really trying to sort of visualize what is invisible, but also to sort of defamiliarize whatever we are familiar with, such as just, you know, this sort of pants, pieces of pants that we see, or this glove that you see here, the sort of revealing also these sort of uncanny aspects in the familiar, and the question, and sort of questioning their everydayness. And while going through Hill's archive over the last year, I came across a sentence that I keep coming back to, which he wrote in a letter to Charles Eames, in which he writes, quote, "What I will do will be important in the future." And I think, yeah, Hill was really looking closely at a practice that very carefully unfolded between categories and everything in between, which is also why we chose the title Something Other Than Either for the exhibition at Kunstverein München. One of the sort of central, I guess, also curatorial questions, which I will come to now in relation to the practice of, well, working in the archive of that work, which is right now located at a small university outside Philadelphia. It's called Acadia University, which I spent a lot of time in this windowless room with hundreds and hundreds of these boxes, is the sort of larger question of framing, and framing not in the most immediate sense of works that are framed, but how to basically contextualize a practice that often also deeply contradicted itself. I will come to this now. And maybe also, we can discuss this later, maybe the question of how the copier machine, or the tendency of the copier machine to obviously enable and support the production of quote unquote too many works, is something that we thought about as well. And sort of along the lines of that complexity and the contradiction that often her work has, I want to take a closer look at the work titled Body Parts and Parts of a Human Body. And for this, it's important to take into consideration that although Hill never sort of specifically has been associated with the women's feminist art movement in the sort of 60s and 70s, I would argue also because of a lack of a lack of infrastructure, of not being shown, of not being institutionalized around that time. I would argue her work and her method was a very subversive and feminist response to the very confined spaces of domestic economy. And after my first visit to the archive in early 2018, and after reading and researching her life and work more, I became aware that Hill was a quite successful model, a couture model, at a very young age. Just one example, she was, as I showed you before, she was on the cover of the French Elle. She was very young at that point, she was 21. And Hill was very early on in her life confronted with the dominance of a male gaze, the gaze of the photographer. And in there's this book which we republished, I will show you later. It's called Letters to Jill. Jill Cornbly is her gallerist at the time. She writes, quote unquote, "Many copy artists are women and only copy themselves. I don't copy myself, but images were made of me for years, and this gave me a sense of reality. The reality of an object, perhaps," end quote. And this sentence stayed with me through working in the archive, and also making me think how she sort of seemingly stood apart from a lot of these feminist tendencies of art production in the 60s and 70s, where the female body was often taken as a starting point, thinking about how to extract it from systems of fetishizing and also objectifying representations, or to maybe, how a lot of artists did in the 60s and 70s to basically use the copy machine to get as far away from sort of oneself as possible through the use of the reproductive apparatus. However, going back to the archives at Acadia University to continue working towards this exhibition Kunstverein München, I was surprised to find more than hundreds of xerographs depicting parts of a human body, which it's very likely that this is her own body. She also speaks about this in unpublished manuscripts and unpublished diaries. We see a breast, we see a shoulder, we see sort of a face emerging from the dark space of the copy machine. It's a very playful, but also very sinister staging oneself, not as a whole, but as a fragment. And in these works, like the majority of the works in the archive, all of these works have never been exhibited. And we can, as I said, almost be sure that she copied her own body parts, as she titles these works. And instead of sort of simplifying the artistic production afterwards in the curatorial process that I was and we were working towards in the format of an exhibition, I decided to very consciously map out these contradictions and the fractures, and also, well, discontinuities within self-understanding as an artist. We framed the works, as you can see here, shown on the wall above these amazing radiators that we have at Kunstmeier, and in spatial proximity to the letters, in which Hill described just years before that she wasn't interested in sort of working and appropriating her own body as a material for her artistic production. And in this context, I went back to someone that just frequently was at my on my mind around that time, was the writer Ashton Cooper, who was addressing the problematic notion of the figure of the quote-unquote overlooked female artist. He wrote, quote, "It is essential that we complicate these stories. Writers, along with collectors, dealers, and curators, are all part of an ecosystem that is constantly forming and unforming art history. So instead of focusing on the moment when these women were finally, quote unquote, found, and by extension on the institution that was gracious enough to do so, I propose we talk more about that period when she was toiling away in obscurity. What was she doing then? Where was she showing? Who was she in community with? How did her practice change? What forces of exclusion did she face?" And I think that's really interesting to consider, end quote. And I think that's really interesting to consider because, like many women artists that matured in the 70s and early 80s, acted in response to many different forces of exclusion of their voices, experiences, and artworks from gallery, museums, collections, and publications, and consequently archives. And even though Patty Hill most frequently worked outside of a conventional institutional context and exhibited very regularly, as I said before, she also wrote about the process of publishing, as in to make things public. Quote, "I have always thought publishing should be like taking your clothes to the laundromat, so to the laundry machine," end quote. To sort of conclude today, and sort of get into the discussion with you about the work. I think Patty Hill was her whole life very conflicted about, and quite ambivalent about, her sort of also dual identity of both being a writer and being an artist, and working with a copy machine that was essentially also a testimony to that, because it was well, xerography basically translates to dry writing in Latin, but it also is a machine that was specifically invented not to reproduce images, but essentially to reproduce text, and basically the misuse of that machine and her dual identity of both a writer and an artist dealing with visual material was something that sort of stayed with her whole life. And so often the case which is so often the case sort of with Patty Hill, but also in general working with artists. She had the sort of perfect words to describe that. I came across that sort of looking back into some of these unpublished notebooks, as well as her diaries from the 70s and 80s. And she wrote at like sort of the bottom of a page, when I'm famous, I hope someone will compare me to myself, which is where the title of the presentation comes from. And at the very sort of end, at the bottom of the page, a sort of small scribble: I'm not afraid of the future, but of not surviving until the future. And I'm sort of going to end there. And if you're interested in sort of going deeper into her practice, you can look at the book that we published. It's titled Letters to Jill, and it costs €7, and you can still order it via Kunstverein München. And yeah, that was it for today, and I'm looking forward to being in conversation with you all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maureen, for the talk. We will meet again in 15 minutes and post a Q&A link for a Zoom session under the YouTube stream. And yeah, let's meet you there in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Cool. See you in 15.